So it says on the poster, I define jazz. That's really like defining the undefinable, really. However, we'll see what we can do. As you're all super bright people, I'll get you to contribute a little bit. To really identify what jazz is, I'm going to play two things. So a bit of musicology first. We're going to try and look at what jazz is, what it's about, and then a bit of history, and then a bit of where we go from now. Okay, so that's a three-part, tripartite talk. So just analyse these, just wait for these people to come in, take a seat. If it was Ronnie Scott's, we could offer you drinks, but sadly it isn't. But it costs much more to come in. Okay, so what you have to identify is what's the difference between these two things I'm going to play. I think we're going to both be in C. Right, so it goes. Okay, you'll know it very well. So what's the difference between those? Obviously, a clear difference between those. Have a seat. So what's the difference?
Modal.
Modal. Oh yeah. Okay. So the second piece compared to the first. What's the difference?
Syncopated rhythms.
Yeah. Okay. This is good. It's like definition of jazz. So we've got syncopated rhythms, which is really an important aspect of a lot of jazz. What do we mean by syncopated rhythms? Emphasis off the beat. Like that, yeah? What else? Syncopated rhythms. So the rhythm is very different. What did it hopefully do, which is a term used in jazz? Extemporize. Oh yeah, so there's a lot. So there's improvisation, which in the Grove dictionary is often referred to as extemporization, as though it's something evil and terrible that you shouldn't do too much of. Yeah. So there's improvisation, yeah. In which piece? In the second, do you think? That's a bit of a trick question. Because actually both.
Conventional ornamentation. The second piece has improvisation around more of the different aspects of the scale, whereas the first piece was more conventional organized scale.
Yeah. So the first piece was meant to be. What could you recognise anything in it? Anything you've heard of before? Yeah? Can you think of a composer? Yeah. So the first piece, was it Mozart? Okay, the first piece was really Mozartian. And Mozart did a whole series of variations on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, well worth listening to. If you can listen to that, absolutely stunning. So that was my sort of pastiche imitation of that. Okay, and the second piece, so it had syncopation, and it had improvisation, and what else? Yeah, so another thing that jazz musicians do a lot is change the harmony quite a bit. Yeah, so Mozart does that a little bit, but quite subtly. So variations like that on something that's quite straightforward is typical of jazz. And the more modern the jazz, the more the variation, and the further you go, I suppose, from what's original and what's straightforward. Okay, so the key aspect of the key form about jazz is jazz musicians often state the tune, then they tend to improvise on it, and then they restate the tune and stop. But as you notice at the end, there was a sort of tag ending with an extra bit put on. So jazz musicians also have an introduction and also a tag ending. And that's the form that most jazz takes. What instruments are used in jazz, do you think?
Not quite bass.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so the key instrument is the bass. We could use bass guitar, use double bass, and what else goes with that? As a unit?
The drums.
Yeah, bass, drums, and piano. So that makes up the rhythm section. So if you play the piano, the more instruments you have, the less you need to do on the piano. Unfortunately, there's nothing else here, so you have to kind of do everything on the piano. With two hands, that can get tricky. What other instruments? So that would be your rhythm section. Bass, drums. What other instrument might you add? What? Yeah. Yeah.
Saxophone.
Yeah. Okay, so in the rhythm section, you might add a guitar. And they'd all play solos as well, which is improvised bit. And then in the front line, you might have what instruments? The trumpet, you said? Like Louis Armstrong. What else? Of course. Saxophone. Okay, that's Stan Getz, worth listening to. Oh yes, voice. Okay, so you have voice, which I was thinking trombone perhaps. But you can get people who play jazz violin, like Staffan Grappelli, which is stunning. Or you can, I think, come across jazz cello. Tuba sometimes used instead of a bass in 1920s jazz, so that tends to be instrumentation. You can also use the bassoon, I've come across, so there's quite a wide range of instruments, as we'll see as we move on. So if we think in terms of harmony, most Western music is based on what you might call harmonic tension in major and minor keys, from really, I suppose, the early 17th century, like from Monteverdi, until sort of mid-20th century. A bit scary saying these things with director of music sitting up there, but I'm waiting to be contributed. So just to illustrate, if you want to understand classical music, and you want to understand jazz, and many other musical forms, understanding harmonic tension is quite important. So what was probably the greatest group in the 60s in the UK? Probably the Beatles. A lot of musicologists regard the Beatles as writing tremendously profound music in some ways, worthy of analysis. And just to give a little example, we used yesterday to illustrate harmonic tension. So the key thing about harmonic tension, think of a mountain. So we start off at the bottom in our home key. Then we gradually go up the mountain, maybe come back a bit, go further up the mountain, and in relief, eventually go back to our home key. So I'll just sort of illustrate that concept. You can see it lasting for maybe, tens of minutes in a Beethoven Brahms symphony. This will be a bit quicker. Right. So home key is F. And then you device is used a lot by jazz musicians and classical musicians and other musicians. Just coming to the basis of jazz. Jazz began really in 1919. Where did it begin? Do you think? What country? So back in the United States, particularly where? So like again New Orleans, and why did it begin in New Orleans? So what mixture was it? A mixture of different cultures really. So there's the French Creole culture and also the black culture. The Creole culture brought marching bands, and what other genre was popular in the 1910s? Perhaps give you a hint, which is syncopated. Okay, no, what's that?
Ragtime.
That's a ragtime. So you have ragtime mixing with what other culture do you think? Which gives us this?
Blues.
The blues. So this combination, this mixing of cultures of ragtime, marching bands, and also the black culture, the blues culture, from call and response singing in the 19th century. It came from Africa, according to some musicologists. This combines in tremendous melee to produce jazz in the 1920s in New Orleans. And that's how jazz began, really. If we just look at blues, then what is the blues then? And blues is a big influence in jazz. It's almost impossible to disentend it. So when people improvise, they use all the blue notes. What's a blue note then? There's even a jazz club in New York, some of you may have been to, called Blue Note. Sorry?
Seventh.
Yeah, so harmonically it's just a flat in seventh. So if you get a C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. And then what other notes, key note of blues scale? Some of you do I know music? What?
Minor third.
Yeah, so minor third. So that's classic sort of blues sound, yeah? So blues scales are based on minor thirds and minor sevenths, key part of it. And as jazz developed, jazz musicians tend to colour chords. So we saw that chord in Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Jazz musicians find that triad a bit boring. So we'd add a 6 to it maybe, like that, which warms it up a bit, you might say. And then invert the chord makes it more interesting. Yeah. Or you might, instead of adding the 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can add the flat and 7th. Yeah. Or add a ninth as well. Or the more modern jazz you get, the more they add, okay? So that's a 11th, I think. Yeah. So we're getting to like the 1950s now, probably, really. And then what we can do is really put two chords together, which Debussy did frequently. Just diatonic, I think. Is that right? Bitonal. I mean bitonal. Thank you. So like this. Okay. Okay. So as jazz develops, the harmonies develop over time, and this happens quite quickly. The whole of jazz development goes from the 1920s really to the 70s, 80s. In those sort of approximately 5 decades, jazz develops from very simple classic track jazz to ultra-modern jazz and new different strands of jazz, of course. So let's just see how you are doing a bit of jazz rhythm, okay? So if we split you into groups, it could be quite fun. So this group here seems pretty competent. So we're going to play a jazz. The two teachers will escape with it. This is pressure too much. So we're going to straightforward. So if you do the offbeat, so if you keep that going. So that's this group here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Let's practice that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Quite together, isn't it? Would you make the percussion section? Okay, that's good. Well done. Very good. And then let's do something more interesting. Where should we have? Right, this group here. Okay, next row. If you do. Okay, try that. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, let's try together. Try together. So can you remember what you're doing? Offbeats. Don't forget what you're doing. Okay. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. See how competent you all look, because you would try triplets at the same time. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll try that. Just you. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Being a jazz drummer is quite difficult, because one person's doing all of these three things kind of at the same time with 2 feet and 2 hands. Yeah. Let's try it together, see what happens. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Shows how amazing you are. So that's an example of something that's polyrhythmic. Wonder what that means. Something quite simple, or many rhythms at the same point, yeah? And so jazz is definitely polyrhythmic, with lots of different rhythms going on at the same time. And this sort of complexity, which grows in more modern jazz, people find a bit disturbing, yeah? Depending on how complex it gets. Right, okay, should we try some singing now? I know we've got some very talented singers now. So if we see if you can do 2 things at the same time. You all just practice doing the offbeat. So 1, 2, 3, focus. Right, so 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Everything there is what? Which would normally be paid. What do you follow in the band? Yeah, the bass. So you need to follow the bass, is basically the Time Lord or the tiny person of the band. Okay. So I was just referring to the nickname of a particular bass player. So the bass player is what you all listen to, nothing else, because they set the where you are basically. And you can identify where you are with the bass. Anyhow, okay, let's try and do some right with that note, not too high or low. Okay, try and do, we'll try and do in jazz. Musicians often use what we call licks to improvise, which is just a little pattern of notes, or riffs, which stretch throughout a changing harmony. Okay, so we'll try a riff and see if that works. So try and do this. So that's on C, middle C, or octave up, or down to one. Do-up, do-up, do-up. Okay, try that. 1, 2, 1, 2. That's good. That works well. You can sing it any octave you like, because we know how flexible you are vocally. Okay? So, I try that. We're getting there. There's not much contribution from director of music. My right ear's not as good. 1, 2. Right, so let's try this again. It's going to be good. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, brilliant. Right. So if you're singing jazz, you need to emphasize the sort of give it a phrase. So each note's not equal, yeah? So you shape it in a syncopated way. Something like that, okay? Right, try it again, and then I'll just show you how a riff works. So I'll play a blues under what you're singing. If you want to clap on the offbeat, you could do that if you can multitask. That's only about half of you, of course. Okay, so are you ready? 1, 2, 1. Right, are you ready? So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, generally is to end. It's a nightmare ending. So most jazz musicians that can play a piece through, and at the end you're thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to end this? What's going to happen? So either end abruptly like that, which shows they're quite together and rehearsed, or the cheesy, simple jazz endings to do something like. Groups do this, so you don't quite want to do just play a long chord at the end and go, and then stop, and the drummer thrashes the drums. Yeah. Yeah, that's quite a handy way of ending. So well done. That's very impressive. So what we're sort of playing there is an anti-jazz made up really of riffs and different sort of melodic. If you're improvising in jazz, you obviously use the chords that we've mentioned. And what was special about that note is it kind of went with all the harmonies we were playing. What I've just played there, and we've just participated in, is a communal LATYMER version of the, what is it, how many bars?
12.
So that's a standard form of 12-bar blues. So I use the word form. Jazz normally takes, unless there's some suite written in the 70s, which can go on forever and get an Arts Council grant, which is quite helpful to people at the time, but such things aren't available after Mrs. Thatcher, of course. I'm making a political point particularly. It's usually 32 bars, or perhaps 16 bars, or certainly 12 bars, because mostly all blues is based on 12 bars. I'll just give you an illustration then of there's a little bit of blues for you. Right, what key should we do? C, stick to C. Okay. It's a suspended chord. So the boogie-woogie sort of continues throughout time in jazz. And a lot of early jazz was based on sort of a ragtime sort of effect. So there's a number, for example, like Muskrat Ramble, which has a ragtime feel, which is very what we might call 20s or trad jazz. So here's a bit of Muskrat Ramble. That's a sort of example of stride piano. So a lot of people like Fats Waller, who's an amazing stride pianist, used to eat and drink a lot for days on end playing and then sort of claps for a few hours and start again. And what's annoying is he used to with one hand whilst looking at the audience, playing stuff on the right hand and also singing. So it's annoyingly like amazing in terms of technical ability. So we have 20s sort of trad, and then into the 30s dance band comes along, and we have big bands that sort of develop. And one of the great composers of music for jazz was a guy called Duke Ellington, and he used the genius of individual musicians he had, like the sax player Johnny Hodges, to write particular things. It's well worth looking up Duke Ellington numbers. Examples might be Satin Doll, you may just have heard of. Another one might be Sophisticated Lady. I'll tell you what we'll do, just to show that you don't have to just play jazz on the piano. Try You Don't Mean a Thing on the organ. Okay? So this is our organ, built by one of Britain's greatest organ builders, maybe one of Europe's best organ builders. How many pipes might be in this organ? The largest organ in Britain is in Liverpool Cathedral, which is about 12,000 pipes. I think that's right. The Albert Hall organ has 9,999 pipes, okay, which is huge. This is a bit smaller. Probably got about 1,500 pipes, I reckon, all in there. Okay, we haven't got time now to look at the technicalities of the amazing instrument, the organ. But various jazz musicians like Fats Waller did play the organ. So this is, I don't quite know what I'm going to do, but this is a great Ellington number called It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, which brings me to another point about jazz, is swing. What do we mean by swing? So jazz, rather like harmonic tension last in classical music from, I suppose, 17th century, mid-20th century, swing in jazz is really rather important from about 1919 until, I suppose, we get to the 60s, 70s, when different forms of jazz, like jazz funk, take over. So what is swing? What it is repeated quaver rhythms, sort of like this. always on the offbeat and that melody and that rhythm, basically, which is meant to be characteristic of a lot of jazz. We couldn't really define that jazz that way because it moves well beyond swing in the last sort of 30, 40 years. Anyhow, this is just a little quick version of It Don't Mean a Thing It Ain't Got That Swing. Okay. Don't quite have that. Then we have development of modern jazz, so that's sort of swinging in style, that's very 30s, 40s. And then so modern jazz begins really as a bit of a revolution. So Ronnie Scott's, they only play modern jazz, apart from at Christmas when friends of mine are let in, such as Digby Fairweather and the old amazing George Melly, when he used to perform there. He's an amazing blues singer, one of Mr. Gisson's favourites. And they used to call it the pantomime, or rather derides you away. So basically there's a big split in jazz between modern jazz and what we might call cloud jazz. And in modern jazz we have the development of bebop, which is lots of really, really fast playing, often on the saxophone, people like Charlie Parker. And then cool jazz, which rather than being East Coast, like bebop, is West Coast, more Californian. And people like that are sort of people like Chet Baker. And maybe the amazing Stan Getz. What's the famous Stan Getz tune you've all heard of? The Girl from Ipanema, with his girlfriend singing the vocals. Okay, so he plays a lot of sort of Latin-orientated jazz. Okay, so the structures of jazz become free and free and freer. And eventually, in the 70s really, we have all kinds of jazz developing, such as rock jazz, funk jazz, folk jazz, and different types of jazz fusion. And people playing Bach in a jazzy fashion. And then people just not honoring any rules at all, breaking all the rules, rather like people did with serialism, you might argue, in classical music, where there's no one key that is dominant, as I was saying earlier. And I'll just try and give you a little example of sort of free jazz. So there's a great jazz pianist called Keith Jarrett, who plays free improvisations. One of his most famous, I think, was in Copenhagen. Partly because the piano wasn't very good, it did lots of rhythmic variations. Anyhow, because it's free jazz, we're going to make it like a 70s jazz suite, so I've just thought of this. We're going to tell a story. We're going to start off in a beautiful Gothic church, and we'll hear something of one of the greatest composers that existed, of course, which was Bach. So it's going to be Bach influence to start off in a church, and we come out of church, we go to a street party, And then we're going to go to the Royal Academy and look at some beautiful watercolour pictures by Monet. Sorry, I mean water lily pictures by Monet, okay, which are currently at the Royal Academy. Now we're going to go back into the church again. So let's see how this goes. Okay, it's very typical of, apart from technical level, of the sort of thing people did in the 70s. And it starts with another useful device in music, the ground bass, which is where we use bass note all the way along for all the harmony. Except I'll probably give up doing that at some point. We went quite quickly from the art gallery to the church. Any particular questions? So we got to a situation where it's completely free in all these different types of jazz. So similar in classical music. Do you think there's one sort of universal sort of music that exists that is dominant? Like in Beethoven's time, I suppose people would write, classical style, and Bach's time, people write the Baroque style. Silence. I think, well, what we face in music, I'll leave you with the question really, is this sort of postmodern situation where everything is sort of retro. We have different fusions of things, and composers often, and jazz musicians often look back. What's quite interesting is you look at modern jazz playing, it's often very similar to sort of thing you get in contemporary classical music, contemporary serious music as well. Anyhow, I just, music's incredibly important, so we have many opportunities in London to go to places like the 606 Club, where in fact LATYMER was performing, or Ronnie Scott's. There's loads of free jazz events, for example, London Jazz Festival, and an amazing, you're in probably the world's greatest city for music in terms of jazz and classical as well. Like only £5, you can go to the Brahms, you're one of the greatest orchestras in the world. And there are tremendous opportunities. So I'd urge you to make the most of those and just sample different types of music, different types of jazz. So thank you very much.